Over the years, we've seen a fair share of remasters, sometimes a simple resolution boost, but other times it can border on a full remake. But with Saints Row The Third Remastered, we have something that manages to straddle the line in a surprising way. It's not clear where this came from or why, but the return of Saints Row is certainly welcome, especially when it looks this good. So to discuss it, I'm joined by the one and only Richard Ledbetter.
Hey John, well this is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, I think the game first came out in like 2011. Recently we had the Switch port, which was, shall we just put it politely, suboptimal.
Yeah.
But now we've got these remasters. I guess we went in without too much of a high expectation level. But well, what do we have here? This is fascinating, right?
Exactly. I didn't expect a lot from it. I mean, it's a 9-year-old game. It's coming out at the end of the generation. You wouldn't have expected that much poured into it, especially when looking back at Saints Row 4, which was converted early on in this console generation, which was a pretty lousy port, if you ask me. But for this one, the developer has gone in and basically made so many changes, adjustments, improvements, and just everything you can imagine that it's really up there. Like, it's genuinely shocking and impressive just how much work has been poured into this version. So let's start with the basics here. This is for Xbox One, PS4, and the PC. It does support the enhanced consoles. So talking on the resolution side, it seems to be 1440p on both of those machines, and then 1080p on the base consoles. And then of course on PC you can sort of do it as you like. And then there's some extra features as well. You can cap the frame rate at 30 or run free. There's various options to adjust the visual quality in there, and it even supports high dynamic range or HDR right out of the box, which is great.
Wow, this is fascinating. It sounds like a bit more of a revamp than we were expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And so obviously then, if you look at all four of these versions, they all look the same, but that's kind of not why we're here. You know, it's great on all machines. We'll talk a little bit more about the performance differences later, but I think let's stack it up against the original game. And for this, I think we discussed this. I kind of went with the PlayStation 3 version, since I feel like that's probably one of the more common console versions, and it didn't have the tearing of the 360 original.
Yeah, that was that's actually the first thing I remember when you first raised this topic with me. It was like, yeah, let's go for the PS3 one. The 360 just tore pretty much all the time. It wasn't a great experience.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it's not a great experience on PS3 either, but it was still better than what the original Switch port. The Switch port has improved a little bit with a patch, but the PS3 version was kind of the best you got on console. So right away, the first thing I noticed is that the entire UI, from the background videos to the text itself to all of the graphics, like everything has been completely redrawn and goes all the way up to 4K native. So if you're on the enhanced consoles of the PC, you have this super razor sharp, beautiful menu system and loading screens and everything. So first impression, really strong. And then the game starts, and this is right from the very first scene. It was immediately evident that, okay, this is not just a normal sort of remaster in the traditional sense. This is, you know, everything is different. All the main characters have been completely remodeled from the ground up with a much greater polygon count. All the secondary characters have been improved, touched up, changed, and it's visible right away. Like this introduction sequence here with Pierce. I love this shot when it zooms in right on his eye. You actually see, you now has a really like very realistic sort of skin shader going on. The texture detail is high. His eyeball detail is exceptional, but it still retains the sort of like hyper like pseudo realistic look of the original game. So it doesn't feel like it loses the style. You know what I mean?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's fascinating that such an old game should get such a large amount of attention this late on in the generation. I really hope, I guess I'm just looking at your notes here, there's a ton of stuff we've got to get through here.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things I forgot to mention when we were talking about resolution, this new version also uses a temporal upsampling. So even though the resolution on the enhanced consoles is 1440p, the temporal upsampling helps a lot with cleaning up the image. Aliasing is almost entirely eliminated, and the edges are just very clean. Plus you have this nice per pixel film grain, which looks great, and various other post effects, some of which can be disabled in the options. But that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg regarding the new rendering features.
It's interesting. It's just like modern features have been retrofitted to this really old game. It's fascinating.
Exactly. And it's not just like the characters that have been updated. They actually went through the game and seemingly made changes to basically all the assets. So both interiors and exteriors have all new geometry detail that's significantly improved over the original game. There's the textures have all been reworked. They switched to a physically based pipeline for this. So there's full PBR rendering in this one now. They implemented something called LSTV, or large scale texture variations, which is designed to give the impression of more variable texture detail for distant objects. So it sort of avoids that tiled look that you would often get in the original. You know what I mean?
Yeah, fascinating.
Right? Like, I know. And also, like, all the props, like the little objects, like, even right away in this cutscene here at the beginning when he's opening the bank vault, you just see this little handle here, the lock, completely redone. And it's the same for just both objects in and out of cutscenes, all the little things. I mean, you can see that it's all derived from the original assets, and some of them are the same, but with the new PBR materials and changes to the lighting model, which we'll touch on in a moment, everything just feels more natural. And it, in some ways, because it retains the cartoony style, the lighting and stuff is so realistic that it almost looks like you're looking at some sort of like diorama. You know what I mean? It's like a Saints Row diorama.
Wow. I'm just kind of baffled as to, I mean, obviously we're not going to be complaining about what they're doing here, but I'm wondering what the end game is. Why put so much effort into this remaster? It's, you know, I'm just kind of curious from a strategic perspective why the developer has gone to these, I'd say they're pretty extreme lengths, aren't they? Because the you know, basically virtually everything has been reworked here.
It makes me wonder if they're prepping a sequel to Saints Row right now. You know what I mean? It's like, it kind of feels like if you're going to put in the effort to remaster a game like this, like, it might make sense to have something else waiting for us, you know, sort of like revitalize the franchise, because it has been a while, and Volition's Agents of Mayhem was not amazing, to say the least. So, you know, this could be a chance to bounce back, and it's a great way to do it. So actually, let's talk about, you know, once you actually get outside and start exploring around, they have a new global illumination system that takes into account light reflection, you know, sort of bounce light. You sort of have the more ambient shadowing. You get a full HDR sky. They reworked all the different times of day so that they play more nicely with the new PBR materials, leading to some scenes that at certain times of the day almost reminded me of that hyper-realistic look that you got in Assassin's Creed Unity, which is unexpected. Even though it's still like a cartoony looking game at its heart, the lighting is striking at times.
There's a lot more going on in the city too as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, there's volumetrics, there's volumetric fog, you know, light shafts going down. The fog itself can accept color values from surrounding lights, so it's much more dynamic. They implemented this crazy ambient occlusion, sort of, they do an ambient obscurance, SSAO, and then they've also baked some ambient occlusion into the various materials to give it enhancements. There's enhanced reflections, so there's like a mix of planar reflection, cube maps, and screen space reflections all kind of combined together. The new depth of field, the chromatic aberration, motion blur, all that stuff's bumped up. And on top of all of that, you know, just they pushed out the density and the detail of the world when you're driving around. Like, I sent you that shot of the field of grass, right? You saw that with the trees and grass.
Yeah, I was reminded of GTA 5, you know, with the current gen version of that, where they, you know, essentially every version had its own level of grass, detail, you know, the sort of density of grass. But at least on this side of things, it's, you know, every console gets the full grass experience this time around.
Yes, exactly. And it's, you know, the thing is though, is when you see these areas and all of that, when I was first playing through, it's like, okay, this looks better. But in my mind's eye, this is kind of still what Saints Row the Third looked like, which I think is this sort of speaks to its success at like capturing the feeling. It's just when I went back and actually compared it to the original version, it's clear that, okay, this is a dramatic change what they've done here. Also, this applies to things like water, like there's rivers and such throughout the game. The reflections are much improved. The water interactions are improved. Man, like they actually included a list of different features that they added within the document for this game, which is like unusual that developers would highlight some of these features. And it speaks to me that like these guys are insane. I cannot believe we keep coming back to this, like we cannot believe this, but it really is bizarre to me that a game like this receives such a thorough reworking.
Yeah, I mean, it is a pretty beloved entry in the franchise, but there was always the feeling that it wasn't quite as polished as it could be. And yet here, it's a whole different ballgame. And of course, this leads us on to performance, where there are some pretty stark metrics to share here. I mean, it's pretty awesome, right?
Yeah, so that was always the problem with the console versions of this game. Extremely variable. I mean, we already touched on 360 and the tearing issue, but on PlayStation 3 it was an uncapped but super unstable frame rate, and it was kind of just as unstable on Switch. And even the PC back in the day, I used to have issues with stuttering and hitches throughout. Like, it never ran quite as well as it should have. But this one is quite different. So by default, I will say all 4 consoles have a 30 frames per second cap enabled. And, you know, we can just kind of get this out of the way easily by saying that pretty much all of them hit a very stable 30 frames per second. I did notice occasional little hitches here and there when sort of traversing the world at a high speed. Not a huge issue, not even that common. But that's about it. So the default frame rate with the motion blur looks and feels as smooth as you could have imagined, but you know, in a game like this on console. So that's a huge improvement. But it's the uncapped frame rate that is interesting, because this has inadvertently become sort of a Hitman-esque style test. And by that I mean, because you can adjust these options, it gives us some insight into the way that the consoles scale when running basically the same settings, right?
Right, okay, yes, because they are the same. Base PS4 and Xbox One, both 1080p, both identical graphical settings. Enhanced consoles, 1440p, likewise. So, essentially, if you are unlocking the frame rate, it kind of does become like a benchmark comparison almost between the two.
Exactly. So, let's start with the best news then. We'll do PS4 Pro versus Xbox One X. And this was the one that was most interesting, because if you're playing on Xbox One X right now, the game nearly hits a locked 60 FPS. Now, I say nearly because there's plenty of instances throughout where you're going to drop into the 50s. When you're in a field packed with foliage, or there's a lot of stuff happening around, explosions, alpha effects filling the screen, all of the typical things, those can drop your frame rate a little bit. And, you know, I'd imagine if you're using a FreeSync display, because this uses VSync, that actually should smooth that right out. So this should look really, really smooth on a display like that. So, you know, that's great. So you can see now, if we compare to the PS4 Pro, what I did is I set up these two areas sort of as a benchmark run, if you will. I started here by just running down the street right outside your first base. And again, you can see that the Xbox One X is doing great, but the Pro, it's more down into the 40s and sometimes getting into the 50s. But it's not nearly as stable as Xbox One X. So, and this is just running around, nothing really happening. It's just, you know, but the city areas tend to be fairly heavy compared to even like the scripted missions, because that's where there's the most stuff happening around you. And the world itself is more packed with cars and pedestrians than the original version as well. So I decided then to jump in this car and drive across this long bridge, which sort of slices right through the middle of the game world. And, you know, traversing at a high speed, dodging traffic, you know, this is sort of pushing the IO streaming side of things. It can kind of hit the CPU sometimes, and it sort of tests everything, if you will. And yeah, I mean, the PS4 Pro just can't quite keep up there. And so, but that's expected, right? When you look at the difference in the GPU and everything, and the slight clock difference even on the CPU, maybe. You know, what do you think? I mean, that makes sense, right?
Yeah, it's great to see this, basically a really good apples to apples, like for like level of scalability between the two that you can kind of map. Obviously, it falls down a bit because the Xbox is at 60 frames per second, therefore capped for quite a lot of the time. But when they're both running beneath 60, you do get that kind of interesting scalability comparison there. What I find quite fascinating about it is just the basic concept of an open world sandbox game transitioning across from last gen to this gen, actually targeting 60 frames per second or able to hit 60 frames per second, because obviously the big complaint from this generation has been the fact that the leap in CPU from last gen wasn't really that pronounced. So the fact that you are able to actually get 60 frames per second with some degree of consistency on the Xbox One X there, I mean, I think that's almost a reason to consider a double dip almost if you already have the original game, because the experience is transformed, right, over and above the visual differences.
Absolutely. I mean, that makes a huge difference, and it's also worth considering. We're already almost there. But you would imagine if you're running this on, say, Xbox Series X later this year, and honestly, probably PS5, it should solve that issue entirely, and that means we'll have a nice locked 60 FPS version of Saints Row the Third with these enhanced graphics on console. So to me, that's very promising. It's nice to have that.
Yeah, I mean, just generally the idea of having an unlocked performance mode as a future-proofing option almost is kind of a really nice idea, even if in the here and now it doesn't really work out particularly well.
Yeah, I mean, overall it doesn't work that well. The Xbox One X version is probably the best example. It does get the closest, as we've kind of established, but even that, it still doesn't really hold 60 throughout or anything. There are large stretches where you'll get 60, but it's not completely stable throughout. And also, one thing shared between all four consoles is the slightly slower performance at nighttime versus daytime, I've found. It's most noticeable on Xbox One X only because you might go through an area at a locked 60 during the day, and then it'll be just under 60 when rolling around at night, so there is that to consider. But yeah.
So what about the other systems then? How do they shake out?
That's where, this is a case where perhaps that option is not so useful. So base PS4 turns in performance is comparable to PS4 Pro, yet different. Using the same test, you'll kind of note that there's areas where the Pro is ahead, and then there's areas where the base is ahead, and it always sort of seems to be trading places, despite the fact that the load should be relatively comparable given, the same sort of basic circumstances. Now, of course, due to the way this game works, it's pretty much impossible to line up time of day exactly. You can never have the exact same traffic patterns, things like that, so that can all differ. So with that in mind, I kind of feel like they're very, very similar, but maybe the Pro has an edge overall, but neither one is that smooth, or at least I should say neither one is that stable in the uncapped mode. But they're a far cry from the regular old Xbox One, which, it tries, but it kind of gives me an appreciation. So I haven't played as much of this version on this, and this actually makes me wonder if there's going to be a scenario later in the game at some point where you could dip under 30 FPS on the base Xbox, because it's very close to 30. It sort of seems to hang between 33 to 39 FPS most of the time, occasionally going over that, but it's much closer to that 30 FPS target, which suggests that there's just less headroom overall.
Got it. Right. Yeah. Well, it does seem to be the case then that, if you're running on the base machines, the default mode is 30 frames per second. So just stick with that, right? And I assume the frame pacing's taken care of.
Yes, the frame pacing is perfect across all of them, and PS4, Xbox One X, and PS4 Pro all deliver a very stable 30, as we mentioned, but the Xbox One base, or S, is the one system that doesn't actually quite manage to deliver a stable 30. It's the one where the frame rate just doesn't hold up throughout. So just moving around certain busy areas, especially at night, I did run into drops below 30 FPS. But still, it's good enough overall, I'd say, and it's still vastly better than any previous console release of this game. But if you have a choice, the other versions are kind of better. But yeah, it's a really impressive effort overall with the visual quality leap. This is honestly one of the best remasters I've seen this generation. I mean, it's not a Blue Point release. This isn't like Shadow of the Colossus or anything that sort of sets a new benchmark for that sort of thing. But it's up there. I mean, it retains that original look of the game, but it expands on it so greatly, and it's just so massively improves all the lighting, the effects, like everything. Like the amount of work that they poured into this, it's truly astounding, especially when considering the older Saints Row 4 conversion, which was basically just an increased resolution and a wildly unstable frame rate.
Well, if I look back at the franchise, the Saints Row franchise, it's this game that's the one that I remember, years on. And it's just fantastic that the developer and the publisher have kind of seized on it and just thought to themselves, right, okay, we're really going to push the envelope on this one. We're going to make it as good as it can possibly be. I mean, I'm just trying to think of a way, some kind of vector where they could have improved matters still further. I mean, I guess possibly the Pro could have had a 60 frames per second, 1080p 60 mode, possibly. But beyond that, I mean, wow, this is just really impressive stuff. And it just came out of nowhere. That's the thing that I just find absolutely fascinating about it, is that, as we said right at the very beginning, we just didn't have that much in the way of expectations for this at all, but we were kind of curious to check it out. And man, what a payoff.
Yeah, exactly. It's that weird way that it just sort of showed up. It was announced quietly, it arrived quietly. It had all the hallmarks of being a poor conversion based on just the way it arrived. But in reality, it's really, really impressive, and kind of a stark contrast to some other ones that we've seen recently. One of them that's in further testing right now. But, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Saints Row the Third was probably the high point of the series. I mean, I love the fourth game as well, but I think it's fair to say that they maybe went too far. It was just so ridiculous at that point that, it's like Saints Row the Third was where they found their balance before, there was enough of like a serious tone to it, but it was still like so over the top and just bananas that you could have a ton of fun with it. And yeah, it's absolutely still worth playing today. And it feels surprisingly, I would say modern. Like, it doesn't feel that dated in many ways. So yeah, it's a solid little game and well worth checking out still.
Well, I think the takeaway is that this is a remaster done right. And if we can draw attention to it and hopefully get some sales in the bag for the developer and the publisher there, maybe it's the start of great things to come, and maybe we can sort of establish that this is the way to do these remasters, because it's really impressive stuff.
Yeah, I think that's actually that's the key point here, is like, this is an example of what we want from these remasters. And sure, it's going to be more expensive than the other methods, but I think it's absolutely worth it. It really preserves the game in this beautiful new form, and it makes it a lot more palatable for a wider audience to revisit it. And we can only hope that this leads to more Saints Row. So hopefully that will happen.
So say we all.
Exactly. So I think that's going to do it all for now, though. So thanks for joining me, Rich.
My pleasure.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, of course, be sure to come check out our Patreon, where you can get a direct feed download of it. Follow us over on Twitter. Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, all that good stuff. You know the drill by now. Come on. It's great stuff. But that's going to do it. So until next time, this is John signing off.